Okay, great. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm thanking Evie for encouraging me to submit a paper for this conference on this subject, and I've invited my colleague, Dr. Ruth Chavez, to join me on what I have found to be an exciting pathway to assess people's sense of ethnic and religious identity in ways that I could not have imagined, as Evie mentioned, many years ago when I met with her. Dr. Chavez is particularly interested in the area of consumer behavior. The realities of our collaboration and of our respective professional positions are such that we have to begin our collaboration with an organized towards a publication that will be necessarily methodological and constructing some sort of theoretical framework to look at religious studies through consumer behavior theory. I'm going to include some of this in today's talk. I will be doing most of the speaking. Ruth will be joining us and giving her perspectives as well. I'm assuming that only a brief review of crypto-Judaism is necessary. It's frequently asserted that 20% of persons with largely Spanish Jewish heritage have significant Jewish ancestry. This comes in part from genetic research. Iberian Jews converted to Christianity in significant numbers throughout the Middle Ages. There were already large communities of new Christians in the mid-1300s. This conversion was accelerated, especially as a result of a wave of anti-Jewish riots in 1391 and anti-Jewish preaching in the early 1400s. The Alhambra Decree, as it's usually called, in 1492 expelled the Jews from Castile and Aragon. Some left, some moved to Portugal, but the most likely result is that the majority of Jews in Spain in 1492 accepted baptism. There's no real consensus about the size of the population, both prior to 1492 and in 1492, but even the low estimates are such that I believe it is unlikely that any person of largely Jewish heritage is devoid of Jewish ancestry. Now, many conversos, Jews of Catholic, Jews who were converted to Catholicism, and their descendants were able to get false papers certifying limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, needed to come to Spanish dominions in the Western Hemisphere. Now, we know that some Judaized. They're documented in New Spain Inquisition records. And there were major autos de fe in the late 16th century and mid 17th century. Research by the late David Gitlitz and others has shown that Judaizing in Mexico dropped dramatically within a few generations. There was little Judaizing after 1650 and almost no inquisitorial interest in Judaizing after this time. I would argue that we should use crypto-Jew most properly to refer to persons who were baptized as Catholics, including descendants of Jews as well, who retain Jewish identity or practices, called Judaizing by the Inquisition, for this early period. But in 20th and 21st century America, the term is often used in general to denote anybody with a largely Hispanic background, and it's sometimes used outside of the Hispanic world, with a hidden Jewish ancestry, regardless of whether they were explicitly aware of this heritage, what they felt about it, whether they preserved any practices or not. And in fact, while I would prefer the more neutral and accurate converso descendant, many people within what I'll call this community prefer the term crypto-Jew. This phenomenon occurs throughout Latin America. It occurs in Puerto Rico, Cuba, Mexico, Brazil, and many other places in what we call Latin America. But we, Ruth and I, are concentrating on Hispanos from the southwestern United States, who mostly identify as being Mexican as the part of their heritage. Working towards publication in consumer behavior journals, Dr. Chavez and I have defined both Jew and Hispanic as pan-ethnic terms, a term referring to the consolidation of groups with heterogeneous and distinct national, historical, and cultural roots into nevertheless a single broad classification. Hispanics may be people from Spain or Latin America, regardless of race. And important to note that in the 21st century, being Hispanic is self-determined. People choose to call themselves Hispanic on census and government forms. Those who do so are considered Hispanic. Those who don't consider themselves Hispanic, don't make this choice, are not. There are about 60.6 million Hispanos in America, about 18% of the US population, a large and by all indications growing segment of the American population. Consumer analysis suggests that this population is young. It has concerns with social justice. It is interested in consumer brands aligned with family and community values, but also that this is a pan-ethnicity that is a social political construct that may have limited utility. This population also sees itself currently and historically as marginalized as a subculture in the United States, and a critical lens must accurately account for the impact of power dimensions such as oppression on the construction of identity and well-being. Jewish demography in the United States is no less complex. While the Jews are a much smaller group, Jews identify with Judaism as a religion, as a culture, as an ethnicity, some or sometimes none of these. The Pew Research Center and others who have studied the Jewish community talk about the growing incidence of Jewish identity dissociated from religion, as indicated by the growth of the category of Jews of no religion. As in the case of Hispanics, the choice to identify as Jewish and the way in which Jewish people identify is largely self-determined. There is no census category for religious affiliation. There is no census data. Jewish demographers identify a core Jewish population, but also identify some 6 additional categories of Jewish population. The largest estimates that there are about 8 million by the broader pan-ethnic definition. However, I would argue that in studying crypto-Judaism or converso descendants within the Hispanic community who identify in some way, shape, or form with Judaism or with Jewish heritage, we have an even broader category, which includes such things as messianic movement, personal research by individuals, activities that indicate some sort of Jewish identity, but totally independent of Jewish communities with association with Judaism, or even responding to community surveys by indicating interest in the Jewish part of their heritage. My informal interviews suggest that these modalities of identification are of extreme importance in understanding the intersection of Jewish and Hispanic identity in the modern US. The study by Reed and Forehand suggests that consumer identity is any category label to which a consumer self-associates either by choice or endowment. I personally found this wording particularly relevant, as many Hispanics in fact associate with Jewish identity in some way by choice, but they narrate it as being one of endowment. In other words, they have Jewish heritage, therefore they are endowed with some aspect of Jewish identity. In recent years, both Spain and Portugal have opened a pathway to citizenship for Sephardic Jews, or Jews of Spanish heritage. In the US, as far as I can tell, the response has largely been from converso descendants. I have to contrast this with persons of Sephardic heritage in Israel and in some places in Europe who've been part of active Jewish communities, and point the fact that was probably the intention of the Spanish authorities to focus on people who identified openly as Jews and whose ancestors had for 500 years. The JCC in Albuquerque has done an enormous amount of work with this community. This issue avoids question of religious identity, avoids questions of whether people identify as Jews to the exclusion of being Christians, and so on and so forth. And they tell me that there are about 13,000 people whom they have helped towards this program. And almost all of them, as I said, are converso descendants. The process is ongoing. Spain, unlike Portugal, has changed the goalposts of this program from time to time. and applicants are, as we speak, rushing to complete ever new demands for paperwork. There is a good possibility that this population provides a well-defined cohort in which to study the nature of Hispanic identity, Hispanic Jewish identity. Dr. Chavez has done a lot of meaningful work in this area, and she is now going to cover some of her work and how it relates to this research stream.
Okay, in the few minutes that I have.
No, Dr. Chavez, I just wanted to let you know, I think I'll let everybody go till 14 minutes because we really, with only 3 presenters, we're okay. So I'll tell you at 14, I'll give you the 1 minute warning. So you have about 5 minutes.
Okay, what I want to do is present shortly, do a little positioning, and then turn it over to Dr. Ward to close it out. All right. So I am among those people who is in that pathway to citizenship. I am not comfortable sharing my story here. It's very personal, but just to let you know that, I'm living that experience. My academic career has been in the study of ethnic identity, especially Hispanic identity, in the area of consumer behavior. So I am a social psychologist who teaches in a college of business. And so my interest is in how do we take this large group, this heterogeneous Hispanic group, and segment into meaningful markets. Dr. Ward has said that this is a growing population. It's comprised of young consumers who have a lot of spending power. So from a business perspective, the Hispanic population is a very lucrative market for businesses. At the same time, taking this heterogeneous population and dividing it into meaningful segments and target markets is the challenge for every consumer behavior marketing manager. And so then if you bring in the Jewish identity, the religious identity, it even adds more layers of complexity around how then do we find meaningful markets to serve. The other piece of complexity that Dr. Ward and I are working on is the idea that whether it's a religious identity or an ethnic identity, it's fluid and contextual. I think that religious identity is less contextual in many ways than ethnic identity, so that people can, a multicultural person can take on different hats and wear different lenses depending on the context that they are in. And so crypto Jews, I think, demonstrate a case in point of that fluidity than perhaps any other group that I can think of. So my point to be made here is I am bringing in a different perspective for Dr. Ward. He's bringing in the cultural perspective and the historical perspective, and I'm bringing in the marketing perspective. So this is a new and exciting research area for both of us. And we're hoping to publish an article in the near future. Dr. Ward?
Ruth has asked me to finish up, so I will point out, and I'll try to do this quickly within the time. As I said, I have a PowerPoint of conclusions from an earlier version of my interest in transmitting identity with a lot of very interesting comments. But because we're working together and Ruth asked us to present together, I wanted to show where this particular research is going. My interests, if left alone, would have been about Jewish heritage and Hispanic identity, how it is informed by genealogy and genetics, about a body of practices and sensibilities, which I call the canon of evidence, and broad questions of identity, including a sea change in the openness of Hispanics born after World War II, and especially today, to identify with the Jewish component of Spanish heritage rather than to reject it completely. Concomitant change in anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. But thinking about marketing and consumer identity gives me a whole range of other ways to try to assess this identity, which I find fascinating. Narratives about crypto-Jewish identity have talked about boxes of what Gitlitz has called in Yiddish tchotchkes, a old Hebrew Bible or a mezuzah or whatever. I don't know that these things ever existed. But in the contemporary world, crypto Jews, who converso descendants of Hispanic origin, talk about travel, heritage travel to Spain, heritage travel to Israel, whether or not to take out memberships in Jewish organizations, and what I'll call gift shopped items, jewelry, books, Jewish items, shopping, and so on, that I have actually seen as being an interesting way of constructing identity. There also are what my colleague Seth has called, well, he's talked about how for anthropologists, the meaning that you assign to artifacts is more important than the actual meaning of the artifacts. And we've talked an awful lot about that as well. So at meetings of the Society for Crypto Jewish Studies, we've had people who've shown a crucifix and talked about a secret box, secret panel in the back for which they expected a mezuzah to a cloth, a parchment to be put in. I don't know that it was designed for that purpose, but that's the meaning assigned to it. And again, this is an aspect of consumer identity. At this point, it is early on in our study, and we are still working on defining a disciplinary, correct approach to meld our two disciplines, religious studies and Jewish studies, with consumer behavior. I'm looking forward to the rest of the work, and since we have limited time, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. That was excellent.